You're listening to Salaamedia live from our headquarters in South Africa.
لا نحتاج المال كي نزداد جمالا جوهرنا هنا. We're starting off our program this morning with an interview. Our guest, a very, very special guest. I'm so pleased to be able to chat to him, and I hope we could be able to bring out the best in the discussion, a wee bit of it. There's so much more to talk about. And our special guest is Dr. Shashi Tharoor, an author, a politician, a former international servant. And it says here, I'm reading from his website, Shashi Tharoor straddles several worlds of experience, currently a second-term Lok Sabha Member of Parliament, representing this name I was battling to get around my tongue, but Thiruvananthapuram in Kerala, the capital city of Kerala. This is where he's representing, and let's welcome him to the program this morning. Good morning and welcome, Doctor.
Hello, good morning. Good night from me, where I am right now in California, but good morning to all of you in Johannesburg.
Thank you so much for your time, for being with us, Doctor. I was so impressed with the Melbourne Book Festival, where you responded to one of the people asking a question about the issue of the colonialism of Britain and what it basically did to India and so forth, And I thought we need to chat about this because we had almost a similar type of problem. I don't know if one can call it a problem, where one of our senior opposition party leaders, Helen Zille from the DA, who opposes the ANC in Parliament here, also tweeted that, colonialism definitely in some way has benefits. She talked about infrastructure and some of the things that happened in South Africa, and it created a storm after that, where people came back it was a very difficult time for her to respond. People didn't take kindly to it at all. So maybe just starting off, Doctor, when we talk about colonialism as such, how would you best describe colonialism to our listeners this morning?
Well, colonialism essentially is the ruling of another country for the benefit of your own. So in the case of both India and South Africa, the Brits came and essentially conquered other people's land, oppressed them, in many cases killed them, destroyed their existing means of livelihood, taxed them, extracted resources from the land, and sent the benefits of to essentially augment their own country, in this case, Britain. And that's certainly what they did in India over a couple of hundred years, came to what was once one of the richest countries in the world. In fact, in 1700, it was the richest, accounting for 27% of global GDP, 23% of global GDP as late as 1800, and managed to reduce it over 200 years of expropriation, exploitation, and loot into a poster child for third world poverty by the time they left in 1947, with little over 3% of global GDP at that point. So there's no question that colonialism works for the benefit of the colonizers and not of the colonized.
Yes. So, Doctor, if we try to understand colonialism and ask ourselves questions that when Britain at that time did all of this, Britain's obviously defined as an empire, but very different from an empire with an emperor. So the type of, how would you then also, again, for a definition, describe, Britain as an empire that controlled close to 35.5, million square kilometers at one given time of the world?
Yes, I correct at one point that the sun never set on the British Empire, but one of the reasons the sun never set on the British Empire was because even God couldn't trust the English in the dark. They would steal what they could. The word loot, for example, was a Hindi word that they incorporated into their dictionaries as well as their habits. And there is no question that the British were extremely good at world conquest. For a while, they ran out of steam in the middle of the 20th century, but certainly for 200 or 300 years, they were the supreme power, both on the high seas, because naval power was a big strength of theirs, and they were also extremely effective in their military tactics. And there's no question that what they did transformed the countries they ruled. When some say that they may have left behind infrastructure and so on, Well, first of all, that begs the question. A lot of countries in the world built infrastructure without having to go to the trouble and expense of being colonized in order to do so. It's slightly presumptuous to assume that South Africa would have had no roads or bridges or railways under the rule of South African native chiefs. I mean, ultimately, if you've kept your prosperity at home, you can buy whatever technology you don't develop. And there are many non-colonized countries that have roads and railways and bridges. So that's the first thing to be pointed out. In the case of India, for example, one of the favorite arguments that many Britons like to make is, well, at least we gave them the railways. Well, I'm sorry, the railways were built to serve British colonial interests and enhance British profits. They were not designed to benefit Indians or facilitate the travel of Indians. They were built in order to extract resources from the hinterland and take it to England, and to send troops into the interior to quell any potential unrest. The routes of the railways were not designed with any other priorities in mind than these. And even the investments were made in a way that would guarantee colossal profits for British investors, paid for entirely by Indian taxpayers. So even the construction of the railways was done to profit the British investor. At every stage, in other words, the infrastructure served British interests first. Sure, when they left the country 100 years later, they couldn't take all the rail lines and trains with them, so they left it behind. But I don't think we're going to give the British much credit for having done something that was manifestly principally in their own interest.
And when, Dr. One looks at colonialism per se from the British side, did they select? Did they pick? Was it coincidental? How far do we go back? Do we then involve the East India Company? Do we involve the Portuguese before that? And we say, okay, fine, this was a period of British rule in India. Or do we only take the period between 1858 until independence in 1947 when we discuss India?
No, certainly not. I certainly go right back to the East India Company. And the most historians will date the start of de facto British rule to 1757, which is when the East India Company's General Robert Clive won the Battle of Plassey, in which he overthrew essentially the Nawab of Bengal, one of the largest and richest provinces of the Mughal Empire in India. And from then onwards, the East India Company's domains kept spreading till by the time of the mid of the 19th century, they actually controlled most of India directly or indirectly. It's also not true to imply that the British government, which officially took over in 1858, had no say before that. On the contrary, the East India Company was in name the rulers of India, but in practice, the British Parliament had a board of supervision after 1774 and made all the key decisions. And the British government had a say even in the reporting lines, as it were, and the appointment of the key personnel, so that Lord Cornwallis, who was sent by the British government to fight the American revolutionaries and surrendered to George Washington at Yorktown in 1781, was then transferred to India, where he proceeded to be Governor General in India and established the so-called permanent settlement that threw hundreds of peasants off their land. So there is no question there was complete continuity. There were even hearings in the House of Commons about the goings-on under the East India Company's colonialism. So don't tell me that wasn't British colonialism. It very much was.
And at that given time, was there a breakdown or was there a weakening of I think at that time it was Akbar and the Mughal Empire, that did the British see an opportunity where, because of the weakness of the rule at that time, that they basically stepped in and took advantage of the situation?
Yeah, it wasn't Akbar. Akbar was a very powerful emperor. The first British ambassador presented himself to the Emperor Jahangir. This was Sir Thomas Roe, 1614, which was the first British ambassador to the court of the Mughal Emperor in India. But he was treated, frankly, as an envoy from a rather small or middling power, paying court to one of the great monarchs of the world. In fact, that remained true 100 years later. Aurangzeb's revenues in 1700, and Aurangzeb ruled till 1707, Aurangzeb's revenues were greater than those of all the crowned heads of Europe put together. They were 10 times the revenues of Louis XIV in his magnificent palace in Versailles. So there's simply no comparison between the riches of the Mughal Empire in India and the relative lack of wealth of the European countries at that time. But after Aurangzeb, there was a steady decline. He was succeeded by increasingly weak kings who essentially devolved power and authority to the people they had appointed as provincial governors, until those provincial governors sort of became de facto kings themselves. People like Nizam ul Mulk in Hyderabad, who became a de facto Nizam of Hyderabad, the Nawab of Bengal, the various other Nawabs, Maharajas and Sultans throughout the country, they increasingly kept power to themselves, and Delhi was further enfeebled by the terrible attack and raid of Nadir Shah of Persia in 1739, which witnessed the butchery of over 100,000 people in Delhi and the looting not only of the treasury but of every private home. It is said that the Persians took back so much loot with them that they declared a tax holiday for the next 3 years in Persia. No one needed to pay any taxes because the country was so overflowing with Indian wealth, including, by the way, the famous Peacock Throne, and for that matter, the Kohinoor diamond. Then in 1761, the Afghans conducted a raid, Ahmed Shah Abdali, defeating by then not so much the Mughals as the Marathas, who were controlling large chunks of northern India by then, but they defeated the Marathas at the Third Battle of Panipat, and that too was a setback to the Indian forces. So there's no question that the Indian presence was significantly weakening, both because of weak rulers and less muscular military control, but also because of successive defeats at the hands of invaders who came in, defeated people, looted, and left. They didn't intend to stay and rule in India or consolidate a larger empire. They were just in it for short-term loot, and that's what happened with both Nadir Shah and Ahmed Shah Abdali. But once they had gone, what was left behind was a much weaker Mughal throne. And by the time the British defeated the Nawab of Bengal in 1757, they certainly had the capacity then to be able to spread their power pretty much unchecked. For a long time, they pretended to do so in the name of the Mughal emperor, because they had a firman that entitled them to trade and to control territory for the purposes of trade. But that was essentially a fiction, and everyone knew that if anyone took anyone's orders, it was the Mughal emperor who would take the orders of the British and not the other way around.
Mm-hmm. And when one looks at entering India and getting in at that time, what did the British basically find? The population of large number of people, but what did they find? Because India was now termed to be the jewel in the crown of the British Empire eventually. So what did they actually discover or find and get to, when they got into India itself?
Right. Well, in the 18th century, India was still what it had been for 2,000 years, the world's largest producer and exporter of textiles. Going back to the days of the Roman Empire, we have debates in the Roman Senate recorded by Pliny the Elder, in which Roman senators complained about the amount of Roman gold that was being sent to India because of the taste of Roman women for the fine cottons, linens, and muslins that Indians were weaving and sending across. And that continued right up to the 18th century. In fact, I've found instances in the literature of English shopkeepers in the 17th and 18th centuries trying to pass off shoddy European-made cloth as made in India, because made in India was the hallmark of world-class quality. And indeed, the aristocracy of Europe used to buy Indian cloth and linens. Dhaka, now the capital of Bangladesh, was in those days the world center of fine cloth production. They had the Dhaka gauzes, light as woven air, it was said, so fine that you could pull an entire sari through a ring. And those were the fine products of India that were being exported around the world. Well, the British couldn't compete with that, so they simply smashed it. They broke the looms in at least one notorious incident, probably more, but we know of one that was recorded by a Dutch observer. They cut off the thumbs of the weavers so that the weavers couldn't weave again. The cities of Dhaka and Murshidabad were depopulated because the weavers, thrown out of work, had to flock to the countryside. The British had found a sophisticated society with industries, with shipbuilding industry, steel industry, textile industry. They had sophisticated banking networks, merchant systems, artisans, traders, and of course they had farmers, but there was no rural poverty because the country was thriving in its cities. And when the British managed to destroy all of that, they destroyed the cities, destroyed industries, threw people essentially into the countryside for work that couldn't sustain them, taxed the peasantry at a level so unreasonable and so inhumanely that peasants started fleeing British-owned territory for territory still controlled by Indian princes where they would get a more decent life. Poverty and famine struck the land. The British, in fact, allowed 1/3 of the entire population of Bengal to perish in a major famine in the 1770s because they refused to help people and indeed were exporting grain from the areas that were most affected to the bread baskets of London. So it really was a horrendous human tragedy. Will Durant, the American historian, called it the greatest crime in all human history, British colonialism. That may be perhaps an overstatement, but there's no question that it was a crime and that great wrong was done.
Yes, now you still on that particular era, 1700, Doctor. We haven't even touched, and probably we'll come towards it as we're chatting along, on the 1943 famine that took place in Bengal, and there where Sir Winston Churchill is seriously implicated, and what basically transpired there. So when we talk...
Well, there is a line of continuity there, my friend, because the British had a fairly consistent policy on famines, not just in India, but even in Ireland. And that is, there were 4 principles. First, you don't give charity because that only encourages idleness. Second, the laws of the market must prevail. So if you want to buy grain from people in markets where people can't afford to buy the grain, that's fine. The laws of the market mean you buy the grain and they starve. Tough. Third principle was the Malthusian one. If the land cannot support the population that's trying to live off it, then some people must die. That's what Malthus said, and the British believed it. And the fourth principle was fiscal prudence. Thou shalt not spend money that was not budgeted for. So the result in all these famines was complete indifference to the sufferings of starving people, a refusal to help them. I have recorded instances, for example, from the Odisha famine of 1866, when kind-hearted people tried to help starving victims of the famine. They were actually arrested by the British and told they would be deported back to England if they tried to help starving people, that the policy was the starving people should be allowed to die. They had an extraordinarily heartless approach to all of this. And a British historian, Professor Mike Davies, has called all of these the late Victorian Holocausts because of how many people died and how little the British did to help them. But we still recoil with horror at what happened in 1943-44 when Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, a notorious racist and imperialist, actually took decisions that resulted in the death of 4.3 million people. What did he do? There was a drought. People couldn't get food. Instead of ordering intervention, the British, after all, controlled the country, to release grain stocks to feed the hungry, he instead ordered grain to be taken out of Bengal and shipped to Europe, not merely to aid the war effort, as apologists like to say, that was the World War II time, but to bolster buffer stocks in the event of a possible future invasion of Greece and Yugoslavia. This meant that people kept dying. There were ships from Australia docking at the port of Calcutta, but Churchill decided that they would move on. They would not unload their wheat. They would move on to Europe laden with wheat, even while people were starving in Calcutta. And when conscience-stricken British officials wrote to Churchill to draw his attention to what was going on, to the results of his decisions, he said things like, "Oh, it's all their fault anyway for breeding like rabbits." He said, "They're Indians. I hate Indians. They're a beastly people with a beastly religion. Let them die." He wrote on the margin of a file, when people were pointing to the colossal death toll that was piling up literally on the streets of Bengal, Churchill wrote on the margin of the file, "Why hasn't Gandhi died yet?" And this is the man whom the British expect us to see as some sort of apostle of democracy and freedom, when really his decisions and his attitudes compare with the worst genocidal dictators of the 20th century.
And what figures are we working around? Was it about 4 million in total? I read up somewhere about 24 million, the number of people that have died. Is it a bit exaggerated? What numbers are we talking about?
In 200 years of British rule, it would be at least 35 million, because an English writer, William Digby, calculated in 1901 that up to that date, 28.5 million people had died. And he gave it right down from year after year of British rule, how many people had died in famines. And between 1901 and 1947, when the British left, there were at least another 7 million deaths. So 35 is a conservative estimate based essentially, principally on a British source.
Doctor, let's talk about Britain brought English to India. Any difference? I mean, are we going to give the British any pluses this morning in any way for anything, Doctor? Maybe IT, technology, anything else that one can look at in terms of what Britain did whilst they were in India?
No, IT and technology certainly not, because the famous Indian Institute of Technology that people refer to when they speak of India's engineering prowess were actually established after independence by Jawaharlal Nehru, the Prime Minister of India, after independence. And in fact, in the entire 200 years of British rule, the British only managed to establish 4 engineering colleges of not particular distinction in 4 different parts of the country. So, no, I don't give them much credit. The British had a policy that they didn't want to spend a large sum of money educating Indians generally. You mentioned English. Well, they were interested in teaching English to a very, very small segment of the population who would serve as interpreters between them and the masses, a sort of buffer between the ruling class of Britons and the vast millions whom they governed. And Lord Macaulay spelled it all out in a famous minute on education in 1835. When he dismissed all of Indian learning, he said that the entire learning of India and Arabia is not worth a single shelf of British books, which is one of the more ignorant propositions, but there was a lot of ignorance on the part of many of these colonialists. And the fact is that here you had a very, very small group of Indians being taught English, and it was intended really to serve British interests. As Macaulay put it, a group of Indians, Indian in blood and colour, but English in their opinions, their tastes, their morals, and their intellect. Which in other words meant people who will listen to us, who will think like us, who will serve us. Well, they may have created a few of those, but Indians were wise enough to seize on to the English language, to seize the opportunities and the learning the English language offered, to convert English from the language of colonial oppression into a language of liberation and nationalism. So that some of the great nationalist writings were done in English, and of course, some of the most magnificent.
Yes, we are speaking to Dr. Shashi Tharoor live from California this morning, and we're talking about British rule. Now, he's got a super book, being an author, called Inglorious Empire, and where he details all the type of atrocities and discriminatory practices, and how, to a great extent, Britain looted India with a lot of things that they've done. And as they came along, the textiles, the jewels, everything along that went along with it. And obviously also to a large extent they used the Indian soldiers, in terms of military and the wars they basically fought, and how they then manipulated to some extent what the time they spent in there. So colonialism, to a great extent, did major damages in many places around the globe. Dr. Tharoor, are you back with us, sir?
Yes, and I was in the process of answering your question about the English language. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you very clearly, Doctor. If you could kindly do that for us very briefly again, please, sir.
Yes, and then I think we will have to wrap up because we've taken a lot longer than I expected. But just to say that on the English language, it was really taught to a very small minority of the Indian population in order to give the British a small group who would serve their interests, who would work with them in order to, shall we say, serve as interpreters between the British and the masses whom they governed. And Lord Macaulay, in a notorious Minute on Education in 1835, actually said that he wanted to create a small group, not to educate the masses as a whole in English, but create a small group of Indians, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. In other words, people who would think like the British and serve the British interests. But it's to the credit of Indians that they took the English language and the opportunities, the learning, the ideas that it offered, and converted that language from a language of colonial oppression into a language of nationalism and indeed of liberation. I think you saw the same thing in South Africa when some of the most stirring nationalist statements were made by South African heroes in the English language. The same is true in India when Jawaharlal Nehru's famous Discovery of India was written in English. So the first Prime Minister of India discovered his own country in the English language, or when he made his famous Tryst with Destiny speech at the moment of independence, when the Union Jack came down and the Indian flag went up, and he delivered one of the great speeches in Indian history, and he did so in English. So when you look at all of this, English became an Indian language. I would much rather have learned it from toothsome VSOs than from the boots of a sturdy British master sergeant. But that's essentially, we got it to serve the colonial oppressors, but we were able to use it very much for our own benefit.
The last one for you, Dr. Tharoor, you need to go. It's already time for you to go to bed. What did they leave behind? Divide and rule? Pakistan, India, the partitioning, 1947. What did they do in that particular field? Yeah,
they left behind many other iniquities. They wrote a penal code we're still stuck with. They created a number of approaches that were designed to serve their interests and which ill served the interests of the independent countries of the subcontinent. But the biggest sin undoubtedly was the sin of divide and rule, because India had always been a country in which Hindus, Muslims, and people of other faiths lived side by side. We had the oldest Jewish population in the world. They suffered no anti-Semitic persecution. We had the oldest Christian population outside Palestine, and they suffered absolutely no persecution. They were allowed to practice their faith in peace. Islam came to India in the lifetime of the Prophet and did so peacefully through travelers and missionaries. A king in the southern state of Kerala, my state, converted to Islam just hearing the message of the Prophet and decided to travel to meet him in Mecca, and did so and succeeded, but he didn't make it back, the king, but he sent back word of his own conversion. And indeed, he had taken some coconuts from Kerala with him and planted them on the soil of the Arabian Peninsula, which is why today near Muscat in Oman, you can see Kerala coconut trees growing in Arabia. That goes back to the lifetime of the Prophet. You have, in fact, example after example. Yes, there were clashes, that was inevitable, but of Aurangzeb, for example, who was seen by many Hindus as an Islamist tyrant, he had Hindu generals fighting on his side. Or Shivaji, whom some hail today as a Hindu hero, he had Muslim artillery captains and generals on his side. So it was not a monolithic division between Hindus and Muslims. People coexisted. In Lucknow, for example, the annual Muharram commemoration was done jointly by the Shias, the Sunnis, and the Hindus together. It was very much a society in which people collaborated. There's lots of evidence that has been unearthed now of Muslims repairing Hindu temples which have been damaged in bad weather, of Hindus thronging Muslim shrines, particularly Sufi shrines and prayer. There was a lot of intermingling and a lot of cooperation between the communities. But when the British saw in 1857, during the Great Revolt of that time, which the British liked to dismiss as the Sepoy Mutiny, but it was much more than a mutiny, when they saw Hindu and Muslim soldiers fighting side by side and under each other's command, under the banner of the enfeebled Mughal monarch, in order to overthrow the British, when they saw that, they said, never again must we allow this to happen. And they proceeded to minute, as a deliberate matter of policy, a policy of divide and rule. And that was to create a separate communal consciousness in each community, so that Muslims would think as Muslims, Hindus as Hindus, and that they would not intermingle. The Indians tried to resist that approach. For example, the Indian National Congress, in the first few decades of its existence, had presidents of every faith. Muslims, Christians, Parsis, as well as Hindus. But the British did succeed in helping transform the national movement by helping initiate the founding of the Muslim League as a rival body of Muslim nobles and zamindars, speaking ostensibly for their community's interests, but serving essentially the British purpose of dividing the nationalist movement. And that process found its ultimate culmination in what any Indian will tell you was the tragedy and horror of partition, when the country was sundered, when Pakistan was cut out of the stooped shoulders of India, and over 1 million people died in the violence that accompanied it, and 13 to 17 million lost their homes. One of the great human tragedies of the 20th century, which also can be laid firmly at the door of the British.
The inglorious empire. Thank you so much, Dr. Tharoor, for being with us. You have yourself a wonderful day, and goodbye to you, sir.
Thank you. Good talking to you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. That's right. Dr. Shashi Tharoor, an author, politician, a former international servant. Shashi Tharoor straddles several worlds of experience. Currently a second-term Lok Sabha Member of Parliament in India.